Good morning. Welcome everyone on this beautiful rainy day. My name is Mark Meulenbelt. I'm an associate professor in the School of Chinese here at Hong Kong U. And it's my great honor to have been asked to introduce Professor Sophie VOLPP today. Sophie and I, we met a few years ago at a mutual friend's dinner party. And actually, it wasn't until last year that we really got to know each other when destiny put us together next to each other on the same flight from San Francisco to Vancouver. And Sophie had a lot of questions about Hong Kong U, which I happily answered. And perhaps it is related to that you are now here. Who knows? So Professor VOLPP is the Catherine and William L. Magistretti Distinguished Professor of East Asian Languages and Cultures at the University of California, Berkeley, where she is also cross-appointed in comparative literature. Professor VOLPP is very distinguished indeed, having greatly contributed to her field and her institution for a long time. At Berkeley, over the years, she has served in many different capacities, including as chair of the Department of Comparative Literature and as chair of the Center for Chinese Studies, a function that she still holds today. Professor VOLPP's research is primarily concerned with Chinese literature of the 17th through 19th centuries, although she has also an interest, more recent, may I say, in libraries of the Republican period. She has published on fiction and material culture, performance practice and stage architecture, the history of sexuality, and the epistemology of reference, which is something that I would love to hear more about. Her books examine the relation of literary words to the world beyond. I have these two capitalized, words and world. Her first book, Worldly Stage Theatricality in 17th Century China, was published by Harvard East Asia Center 2011. And her second book, The Substance of Fiction, Literary Objects in China, 1550 to 1775 by Columbia in 2022. This most recent work, where she looks at physical objects as they are narrated in vernacular fiction, does something remarkable and new. Rather than taking these objects as reflections of historical realities, of real things, Professor VOLPP shows how their sometimes inconsistent descriptions instead invite the reader to use their imagination and reconsider reality. In doing so, Professor VOLPP argues, authors use literary objects to ask us to be aware of the fallibility of our perception and reconsider reality, of how we look at the world, rather than use those objects as a transparent lens to the realities of the past. More deeply, Professor VOLPP argues, by playing with the form of objects, authors play with the illusory quality of phenomenal form. What is reality, really? I suspect that it is this sort of relationship between literary words and physical and phenomenal world beyond, with a Buddhist flavor, that also informs today's talk, titled Minor Character in the Story of the Stone, in which Professor VOLPP will explore how minor characters in红楼梦speak to the novel's stated concern with the teaching of the Buddhist Heart Sutra, the 般若波罗蜜多心经, namely that form is emptiness and emptiness form. Professor VOLPP's talk will last for about an hour, after which we will have ample time for Q&A. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor VOLPP.
Many thanks, Mark, for that very kind introduction, and many thanks to everybody who brought me here today. The work that I'm presenting today is part of a book entitled The World and the Stone, a collection of essays regarding Cao Xueqin's mid-18th century novel, The Story of the Stone. Each chapter of my book analyzes a different aspect of the story of the stone's very persuasive world-making. I examine Cao Xueqin's experimental means of representing unspoken thought, his creation of an infrastructure of minor characters, the historical reference of the confiscation scene of chapter 105, and finally dramatic sequels such as Wu Lanzheng's Jiang Hengqiu. No other novel in the Chinese tradition portrays character with such psychological depth or depicts food and furnishings so brilliantly. It's perhaps because of the success of its world making that stone still plays such a large part in contemporary culture, such that its epiphanies include not just its sequels, but Western opera, theme parks, restaurants, and escape rooms. What I would like to examine today is its world making in terms of minor character, focusing on Hongyu, crimson, and Qingwen, sky bright. How do minor characters contribute to stone's world making? What constitutes minorness? And how do minor characters negotiate with their own minorness? The Argentinian writer, José Luis Borges, in his 1937 review of the new German translation of the 18th century Chinese novel, The Story of the Stone, was negatively impressed by its multitude of characters. The novel proceeds in a manner that is somewhat irresponsible or bland. Secondary characters swarm, and we don't know who is who. It is as though we were lost in a house of many courtyards. Borges' use of the term swarm to describe the secondary or minor characters of the novel speaks to their perceived lack of individuation. It encourages us to think about the minor characters of Stone as an animate heap whose individual members have neither agency nor intention, whose impact is in the aggregate. Stone does have close to 1,000 minor characters, of which only some 350 are known by name. A number, such as the usher or menzi of chapter 4, are seen once, fulfill their function, and are never seen again. The importance of minor characters is heralded by the narrator in chapter 6. So here we have this passage where the narrator interjects at sort of the close of our long prelude, the first 5 chapters that give us the code with how to read the book, and draws our attention to the importance of minor character. And what I would like to call your attention to is the part I have highlighted in yellow at the bottom of the screen. Hawkes doesn't translate this, and it appears only in some editions. But this really reinforces the importance of the triviality, the lowly. He says, if you disdain the trivial minor character, put the book down, right? This is what is going to help you understand the book. This passage allows us to consider what's achieved with the sudden appearance of minor characters and to ask questions about the significance of minor characters in the aggregate. The narrator claims that what the reader witnesses on the page is simply a fraction of the comings and goings of this vast household. The events on the page are extracted from a larger matrix, a tangled skein of hemp, lanma, which David Hawkes translates as an abundance of material. By implication, a multiplicity of minor characters inhabit the interstices of the text. This premise is crucial to the novel's world-making. It reinforces the reader's investment in a totality beyond the mass of words on the novel's pages. Even though no such totality exists, no dozen or so events took place from which the narrator might select, the postulated, unseen, and unrecorded minor events featuring minor characters enliven the visible remainder. The narrator's claim that he has selected the gems from the dross of unrecorded events leads the reader to believe fetishistically that there was dross, that the words on the page are only a part of the whole. The way in which minor characters suddenly appear by happenstance underwrites the claim to verisimilitude. There is a world behind the text that exceeds the cluster of words on the page. The sudden appearance of minor characters, as if by happenstance, then, is crucial to the novel's world-making. The sense that a multitude of minor characters of whom the reader has never heard live somewhere in the void between the lines on the page is reinforced when in chapter 24, Bao Yu meets one of the servants in his own chambers for the first time. And we might notice here that this is Hongyu, right? But we don't know it, right? The character is not named, right? If we look 4 lines down, 那丫头一面, right? So she's just identified by her position as a maidservant, not by name. Hong Yu, or Xiao Hong, hitherto has existed in the undemarcated expanses of the Jia household that the narrator postulated at the beginning of chapter 6. We learn at the end of this chapter that Hong Yu has served in the garden since before her master Bao Yu moved in. She was one of its original caretakers. Even so, she has escaped his notice. To exist beneath his notice is in fact obligatory for a minor maid of her rank. Her words, "There are quite a few of us you've never seen," reinforces the impression that an unseen infrastructure of minor characters lies beneath the network of characters whom we can see. The phrase that David Hawkes translates as "she replied with some bitterness," I have highlighted in yellow, 4 lines from the bottom, right? 冷笑了一声道 contains a phrase 冷笑 that occurs like a motif through the whole novel. A cold smile or a chilly laugh. Often 冷笑 precedes content about which the listener or reader should have greater awareness. It can modify what is said as much as it modifies the speaker, and sometimes alerts us to moments that are important in thinking about how the book functions simultaneously on multiple ontological levels. So 警幻仙姑, Disenchantment, for example, has that 冷笑, that cold smile. Here, what follows the 冷笑 is the assertion that minor characters contend with each other for the protagonist's attention, and that this contention for attention is a determinant of textual attention. So at this point, the reader still doesn't know the name of Hong Yu, partly because her master, Bao Yu, does not yet know her name. She's just Na Yatou, the maidservant. When Bao Yu's senior maids, Qiu Wen and Bi Hun, enter the room laughing, we witness their shock at seeing this junior maid in conversation with their master. As we might infer from Qiu Wen and Bi Hun's struggle with the unaccustomed weight of the water, it was Hong Yu's job to fetch the water, and Bi Hun and Qiu Wen's job to make the tea and serve it. Qiu Wen criticizes Hong Yu after this exchange as a nasty, shameless little slut, although sometimes I think Hawkes' translation there is a little bit harsh, who deliberately seized the opportunity to be noticed by Bao Yu. When we asked you to fetch the water for us, you said you were busy and made us go ourselves. You didn't waste much time having gotten to yourself, did you? Right? So again, notice the way in which紅樓夢creates this sense that there's a finite amount of the protagonist's attention, and that which will be related in a minute to the finite amount that it sort of proposes to of textual attention. If in chapter 6, Granny Liu just happened to show up, Qiu Wen suspects that Hong Yu was waiting for her chance. Hong Yu is a social climber. The daughter of the Jia family's chief steward and his wife, Hong Yu aspires to come to Wang Shifeng's notice by demonstrating an expertise in relaying messages, one of the crucial infrastructural functions of the Jia family servants. Shifeng sends Hong Yu bearing a message to Ping. On Hong Yu's return, she successfully delivers a long message to Shifeng on Ping's behalf. Let's pay attention to that last line there. She gave him a message to take based on the things she thought you would want him to say. What comes next here is a display of Hong Yu's expertise in message carrying. Oh, what was this message based on the things she thought I would want him to say, right? She said he was to tell them, and then we get this long, long, long message that's kind of unreadable. The long message in which Hong Yu tells Shifeng what Ping told Wang helps us think about minorness for several reasons. Firstly, what Ping told Wang was not speech that issued from her own subject position, but what she thought Shifeng would want her to say. Secondly, what Hong Yu tells Shifeng that Ping told Wang is reported speech several times over. Thirdly, the complex message that Wang supposedly delivered and Hong Yu reports is quite confusing because the relatives described are Shifeng's. And they're described as though Shifeng were speaking. So it's Shifeng's Wu Nainai, Shifeng's Gu Nainai, Shifeng's Jiu Nainai, right, who are in question, not Hong Yu's. Even if Hong Yu were related to Shifeng, right, she couldn't use these terms because she'd be off by 1 or 2 generations, right? So each of these three aspects of minorness illustrates the way in which the message bearer must reduce his or her own subject position in favor of that of the person for whom the message is born. Hongyu is elevated in the system of characters above Qiuwen and Bihun by her ability to take messages. In the scene in which Hongyu intercedes to make Baoyu's tea, she in fact delivers a message to him that shows how she has, unbeknownst to Baoyu, anticipated his needs and wishes. When Baoyu asks why she has never been allowed to wait on him or show herself in his presence, she answers, "I don't think it's for me to say. Oh, there's something I do have to tell you, though." Here she implies that she has a more finely graded understanding of social hierarchy than Baoyu. "I don't think it's for me to say." And then quickly turns to her message-bearing function. "Yesterday, a gentleman calling himself Yun came to see you." It's clear that Hongyu has a clear understanding of Baoyu's schedule, even though Baoyu does not know of her existence, reinforcing that enlivening hypothetical sense of a minor character consciousness in the interstices of the text. All right, so to sum up where we are at this point,紅樓夢asserts that characters must contend for the protagonist's attention. And again, that's an assertion that is strategic, right?紅樓夢is acting on us in that way. To the capacity to minimize one's own subject position in order to anticipate the desire of another allows a character to elevate itself out of minorness in the world of紅樓夢. 3, ironically, as the minor characters contend with each other for the protagonist's attention, the way they come to attention is by the capacity to anticipate the master's wishes and minimize their own subject position in relation to the master's. We could call this capacity a hierarchical intrasubjectivity. Our first impression, or on first impression, Hongyu would appear to support Alex Wallach's influential theorization of the role of minor characters in the realist novel, the one in his the one versus the many. I would add here,紅樓夢is not a realist novel, right? We all know that because we've read chapter 5, but it has been read as a realist novel ever since the new Redology of Hu Shi. And it's been viewed as a critique of the social mores of its time, right? This is what students study when they're studying for the Gaokao, right? That紅樓夢is a critique of Fengjian Shehui, right? So there's just an uneasy relationship between that premise of realism, right, and the mythic, fantastic code of instructions for reading the novel in chapter 5. Its characters have more credence among critics as psychological entities than do those of any other Chinese novel. Wallach views minor characters as each having a place in a narrative structure in which the totality of the characters, major and minor, compete for a fixed pie of textual attention, right? So he's not proposing that as a strategy of the text, right? He sees this as a truth of the realist novel. He views each character as possessing a potentially full referential human aspect or an implied humanness. The minor character then becomes compressed by the labor that they perform in service of the protagonist, such that the full person is, as you see in the third line here, squeezed into the flat character, a flatness motivated and sustained by the characteristic that gets derived from the individual only to subsume her. Okay, I can't help saying there, who is her, right? At the end of that last line, who is her, right? He's talking about the Bennett sisters in Pride and Prejudice, but how do those sisters exist except as a mass of words on a page? Okay. Wallach uses the example of the making of a cup of tea in volume 2 of Great Expectations, which perhaps unsurprisingly involves a waiter, an ostler, and a chambermaid, to suggest that the labor that minor characters perform in a novel permits the expansive enlargement of the protagonist. This costly cup of tea is an analog for the protagonist himself. The making of a cup of tea raises the vexed relationship of the gentleman to the many people who produce and underlie his wealth, right? I'd like to call your attention to the very last bit of this. As a single individual becomes more of a gentleman, increasing numbers of people, right, people, not characters, become less whole, confined within a particular activity or function that is necessary to the single and now singular person, our protagonist. So I want to call your attention to the implication that textual attention is finite in these last lines. This is crucial to Wallach's assertion that the realist novel creates minor characters at the price of sacrificing the dignity of human fullness and human particularity. The flat character is not born flat, but flattened because the protagonist expansively inhabits that delimited and finite textual attention. For Wallach, the problem of minor character begins with the question, how can a human being enter into a narrative world and not disrupt the distribution of attention? All of this could be mapped onto the scene we've just encountered, which also describes the human cost, right? The scene we encountered in chapter 24, which also describes the human cost of making a cup of tea. Here in terms of the disruption of the distribution of attention in the narrative world, right? We remember Qiuwen, Bihun, and Hongyu jostling for attention. A disruption that Bao Yu underscores with his question, how is it I've never seen you before? However, we could take issue with a few aspects of Wallach's theory of minor character. First, we should question the notion of compression, right? That a flat character embodies a full person. That is buying into the logic of the beginning of chapter 6, that we have human fullness living in the interstices of the text. Secondly, we should question the assumption that lies behind compression, that characters are round or flat. We've been thinking with those terms for 100 years, since E.M. Forster delivered the lectures in 1927 that became aspects of the novel. And I realize that means that we've been thinking about round and flat characters since the founding of this school. But we have also ossified the notion of flatness in the decades since Forster. Forster, in fact, said that minor characters were like little luminous discs of a prearranged size, pushed hither and thither like counters across the void or between the stars. These discs could suddenly extend and become little globes, right? That is his experience of reading Austen. So his claims regarding flatness are much more impressionistic and mysterious than we remember them to be. And I think this is because aspects of a novel originated as a craft talk. It was, a novelist describing his own manipulation of minor characters, which I think we can hear in his words, most satisfactory, right, at the end of this quotation. I would not devote so much time to Wallach were he not so often quoted, in particular for his notion that there is a finite degree of textual attention to be shared by the characters in a text, which critics take as axiomatic. The notion of a finite degree of attention, I think, is harmful to a reading of紅樓夢.紅樓夢appears to dramatize Wallach's theory of a delimited textual attention. Hongyu is slapped down because she appears to be hogging more than her share. But the notion that there's a finite degree of textual attention is something that紅樓夢employs strategically to create the illusion of scarcity of resources and to create the ensuing tensions. This is partly why Daiyu and Baochai are made to share one quatrain in the pensu of chapter 5, I think. They could each have had their own, right? But that they share a quatrain when no other characters do puts the two characters in the service of a chiasmus that haunts the novel. They are always in tension, one producing the other. In contrast to Wallach's readings, in which the social status of characters is always correlated to their degree of minorness, I would argue that minorness is a capability, sorry, there's the pensu. I would argue that minorness is a capability that characters can inhabit to a greater or lesser degree, no matter what their social status. We see that here when Hongyu exceeds Bihun and Qiuwen despite her lower status within Bao Yu's apartments. The enchainment of characters, which I have for you on this slide, and we could have gone on much further with this, as well as the system of shadow characters, right, which we have in the corner of the slide, can work to blur the hierarchies of紅樓夢. The system of shadow characters in which Hongyu and Qingwen might both be considered shadow characters of Daiyu both clarifies a social hierarchy and elevates some minor characters above others. I should note as an aside here that the system of shadow characters is implied, but not determined by the text, right? We act as though it were a thing, but really it's a matter of various commentators positing minor characters as shadow characters in ways that other commentators find counterintuitive or slightly off, right? Zhou Ruchang, for example, postulates that Shi Xiangyun is a shadow character of Bao Yu. Some people accept that, some people don't. So this is a flexible, supple system rather than a schematic form of arrangement. Where the example of Hongyu allows us to differ from Wallach is it shows us that first, hierarchy is always being negotiated, right? And secondly, that it's not necessarily true that hierarchy injures Hongyu. The compression that Bihun and Qiuwen attempt is unsuccessful. In contrast to Wallach's argument that minorness is characterized by compression, I would argue that minorness is characterized by the hierarchical intersubjectivity that we just spoke of. Minor characters show that they have the capacity for this intersubjectivity by anticipating the major characters' needs, taking messages for them, sending messages that say what they imagine the major characters would want them to say. And because this intrasubjective space is negotiated by minor characters who are well aware of the need to respect social hierarchy, Hongyu's "it's not for me to say," there is a dilution of subjectivity in favor of the intrasubjective. Minor characters, in fact, have to anticipate the subjective space of the major characters. Ping has to be able to anticipate what Xifeng would say to be able to do her job. The subjective space occupied by the minor characters, then, is an informed space that's permeated by an awareness of the needs and wishes of the major characters. It's incorporated hierarchically, and it's coded hierarchically, and then because it's intrasubjective. Because it's intrasubjective, it's elastic, neither flat nor round. It can puff from a disk to a sphere. Okay, so let's take a quick look at this slide in order to sum up. We have this sense that there are a finite number of major characters who comprise a certain kind of structure, right? We see that in the system of shadow characters, right? Or the enchainment that I showed you earlier, right? So the logic by which minor characters are the shadow characters of the major characters, in a way, extends this thinking that we saw in Wallach, right? The characters are compressed people, right? Qingwen is in the likeness of Daiyu, right? The notion of this swarm of minor characters that we started with in chapter 6, however, moves us away from that focus on individual characters that can perhaps be linked to biographies of people in the world out there, as we have with the Soyin School, right? Moves us away from the idea that major characters might have had some kind of historical match, right? And you know, as you all know, Hu Shi, Gu Jiezhgang, and also Wu Shichang, right, spent a lot of time trying to figure out the relationship of Bao Yu to Cao Xueqin, right? Here I'm saying, let's think about characters in the aggregate rather than assuming they're compressed persons, right? But I also don't want to have too tidy a division between infrastructure and structure. We can see that characters emerge from the swarm, right, from that infrastructure, and then move into structure, right? So they move easily from infrastructure into structure, maybe as they're moving from disks into spheres, right? Okay. So let's go to our second example, right? We saw that the abrupt entrances of Liu Laolao in chapter 6 and of Hongyu in chapter 24 contributed to Honglou Meng's world making, in that these entrances, as if from nowhere, give the sense that there's an infinitude of characters in the interstices of the text. We've seen that minor characters contend for the protagonist's attention, and that the idea of a competition for Bao Yu's attention is reinforced by a manipulation of textual attention. We also saw that minorness can be partly defined in terms of the capacity to reduce one's own subject position, anticipate of the wishes of another, to hold an intrasubjective space. What happens when a character who is clearly coded as minor enters abruptly, but is unable to perceive or hold that intrasubjective space? The maid Dian is one of those characters who make a single brief appearance in the entire novel. What you have here is it. In chapter 30, Dian interrupts a sensitive conversation. Bao Yu has just offended Bao Chai by likening her plumpness to that of the Tang Dynasty consort Yang Guifei. It's at this moment that Dian asks Bao Chai for her fan, saying, "I know Miss Bao's hidden it. Come on, miss, please let me have it," right? Bao Chai retorts to this relatively free comment from a maidservant with a furor that reveals just how stung she has been by Bao Yu's previous comment that plump people fear the heat, telling Dian, "你要仔细, watch out," right? And go ask those other mistresses, gunyangmen, who horse around with you laughing day after day. Dian flees. The commentator states that was Dian. And with this, her role in the 120 chapter narrative comes to a close. In contrast to Hong Yu, right, the maid who's slapped down only to be given a degree of textual attention that Qiuwen and Bihun never have, Dian is the maid who gets slapped down and never appears again. So why would Dian make this brief appearance in chapter 30? We could say that, as was the case for Hong Yu's appearance in chapter 24, the scene contributes to the impression that there are multiple layers of xiaoyatou, minor maids, who might unwittingly step out of place and then slip back or be slapped back into it. But something more is taking place here. Dian's name bears a graphic resemblance to Qingwen's, both containing the character Qing within them. And when Dian interrupts the conversation to ask Bao Chai for her fan, we have a sense that the scene in which Qingwen tears fans in the next chapter is being heralded in some way. But in what way? What this very short scene, really just 3 sentences, shows us is that the affordances of fans and servants can be similarly understood. Dian plays with the role that the fan plays in chapter 31. She's there to be torn or to be torn into. So here I'd like to spend a moment on the word I've just used, affordance, and I realized just before I walked in that I should have had a slide for it. So imagine that we have a slide. But James Gibson, the psychologist who coined the term, wrote, "The verb to afford is found in the dictionary, but the noun affordance is not. I have made it up." I find that so charming. I have made it up. I mean by it something that refers to both the environment and the animal in a way that no existing term does. It implies the complementarity of the animal and the environment. So since it is a made-up term, since he made it up, it can be a little confusing, right? And there's one of his examples that was very clarifying to me. He talks about how birds of prey are attracted to the smell of carrion, right? So humans would be revolted by the stench, but to a raptor, the carrion is actually very attractive and smells very attractive, right? So the affordances of the dead meat are relational and dynamic. Right? So we could similarly talk about the affordances of mailboxes of different sizes. People do that. Shopping baskets versus shopping carts, iPhones versus Androids. But let's talk about the affordances of fans and servants. Dian does not understand the affordances of a servant. She interrupts the conversation of the masters, asking them to do something for her. "Have you seen my fan?" It's not the affordance of a servant to play with the mistresses. And she does not understand the affordances of a fan, right? Is it usually something that a mistress has hidden in a game? This is why she appears here, before a much more important conversation about the affordances of servants and fans that takes place between Qingwen and Bao Yu in the next chapter. The word affordance does imply relationality, but it also implicitly inscribes hierarchy, right? As we have seen the example of the bird of prey and the carrion. In the terms of the quotation from Gibson that we just examined, Bao Yu would be the animal and his servants the environment. In the final scene that we examined today, I'd like to ask whether a servant can reflexively or recursively understand her own affordance in a way that allows her to negotiate with social hierarchy. Hong Yu's expertise in carrying messages showed that she understood the affordances of a servant. But in that instance, in Gibson's term, Shifeng was the animal and Hong Yu the environment. How might the scene in which Qingwen tears fans be different? And how might that difference be related to their singular understanding of the affordance of a fan? So as chapter 31 opens, Shiren, who's Bao Yu's primary chambermaid, has just spat a mouthful of bright red blood on the floor. Bao Yu mistook her in the dark for a junior maid, and a temper at having been kept waiting outside the door gave her a kick after she opened it for him. It is Duanwujie, the double fifth, but an attempt at a party has fallen flat since Bao Chai is still angry with Bao Yu for comparing her to the plumpness of Yang Guifei. A glum Bao Yu returns to his rooms. Qingwen comes forward to help Bao Yu change his clothes, but she unwittingly treads on a fan, breaking the bony parts, right? 将骨子解着. When Bao Yu reproaches her for her clumsiness, Qingwen shoots back. Yesterday, you kicked even Shiren, right? 连Shiren都打了. Today, you're finding fault with me. Whether you want to kick or beat, it's up to you. I only stepped on a fan. That happens all the time, right? The question of the physical affordances of both servants and fans is alive in this passage. Whether you want to kick or beat is up to you. Later, Bao Yu returns to his quarters drunk. Later, when Bao Yu returns to his quarters drunk after a party at his cousin Xie Pan's, he finds one of his maids lying asleep in the courtyard. Imagining that it is Shiren, with whom he already has a sexual relationship, he wakes her with a push. It is not Shiren, but Qingwen. When Qingwen tries to evade him, saying she's about to have a bath, he suggests that they bathe together. She says derisively that she's not planning on fetching that much water, reminding him that the last time that he had a bath with Bihun, they splashed water everywhere, including the bed. She then deflects his advances by suggesting that he cool off by having some of the fruit that the maids have kept in a crystal bowl full of iced water waiting his return. When Bao Yu then suggests she bring him the fruit, Qingwen parries him again. You've already told me once how clumsy I am. I can't even drop a fan without treading upon it. So I'm much too clumsy to get your fruit for you. Suppose I were to break a plate. That would be terrible. Her refusal to serve gives her the appearance of autonomy. In reply, Bao Yu expands upon the affordances of fans. If you want to break it, by all means break it. These things are there for our use. What we use them for, right, their affordance, is a matter of individual taste. For example, fans are made for fanning with, but if you prefer to tear them up because it gives you pleasure, there's no reason why you shouldn't. What you mustn't do is use them as objects to vent your anger on. Okay? So the affordance of a fan is not simply fanning. Fans can be for tearing. There's something insidious, though, about this remark. Bao Yu's not making a philosophical statement involving fans here so much as he's making an indirect apology to Shiren for having kicked her to vent his anger at the end of the last chapter. Naturally, he didn't mean to kick her. He mistook her for one of the junior maids. Okay? When he tells Qingwen, if you want to break it, by all means break it, the term that Hawkes translates as break, maybe we should go back there, is da, right? In other words, it's fine to beat a servant for pleasure, but not to use a servant as an object to vent your anger on. This rumination on the kick to Shiren is made possible by the link between the affordances of servants and fans. Okay? After Bao Yu delivers, I had cut this part out of my text, but we could look at it really quickly. So the last line that Bao Yu has here,你爱打就打, right? Where are we? when he talks about the affordance of fans, he says, don't get into a passion and start taking it out on things. That is the golden rule, right? Here. 只是别在生气时拿它出气, right? 这就是爱物了. And I spent a long time with 爱物, and then I discarded it, which is why I originally hadn't planned to talk about it today. But 爱物is a term in Mencius, right? That the Sanjia commentary calls our attention to, right? And so Mencius, right, in end of his chapter 7, right, talks about how the Junzi cherishes things, but not treats them with humanity. He treats people with humanity, ren, but not as he treats his parents, right? So we have a hierarchy between qin, ren, ai, right? Ai being the lowest. The reason I thought I wouldn't go into this so much is because the commentary that we usually use actually postdates Cao Xueqin, right? So D.C. Lau talks about 人民are 爱物, right? He treats people with humanities and is sparing of livestock because the commentary glosses 物 as livestock. But I think that we don't need that because again it postdates Cao Xueqin, right? Okay, so after Bao Yu delivers the homily on the legitimacy of smashing, tearing, and breaking things, Qingwen exclaims, "Give me your fan to tear. I love the sound of a fan being torn." Here, she, echoes of Jianer, audaciously requests that the fan that Bao Yu bears on his person be given to her. This is his fan, not a spare fan from the box, right? The text then attempts to represent the sound of a fan being torn. Bao Yu held it out to her, right? She took it eagerly. And then here, I don't know why, but Hawks uses cha as the onomatopoeia, right? The term is chi, right? Chi, chi, chi. She tore it several more times, and that's important. We're going to get to that in a minute. So here, the Chinese text emphasizes the sound of tearing in a way that does not emerge in Hawkes's translation. Rather than well torn, the original reads, "That sounds good. Tear it again, make that sound again," right? 想得好，再次想。With the onomatopoeic chi, Cao Xueqin emphasizes the sonic qualities of the tear rather than the physical act of tearing, so that the aesthetic sensual aspects of tearing the fan are emphasized. Now, as Y.E. Li has observed, this scene embeds references to the femme fatales Mo Xi, the consort of the tyrant Jie, last ruler of the Xia, and to Bao Si, the consort of King You of the Western Zhou. Because Mo Xi and Bao Si enjoyed the sound of tearing silk, Jie and You sent them silk to be torn to please them. It is Bao Si that Bao Yu refers to when he uses the phrase 千金一笑, right? The ancients used to say that for one smile of a beautiful woman, 1,000 taels are well spent. For a few old fans, it's cheap at the price. So Cao Xueqin embeds the references to 千金一笑 by using the character chi to designate the sound of tearing silk, right? Elsewhere in the first 80 chapters, indeed everywhere else in the entire 120 chapters, the character chi denotes laughter. By borrowing this character to describe the sound of the fan being torn, Cao Xueqin uses a homonym that combines laughter and the sound of the tearing of the silk. Cao Xueqin embeds the allusions to Mo Xi and Bao Si, but he also overrides them. What's interesting to me about this scene is that it is not colored by the moral overtones of the references to Mo Xi and Jie, Bao Si and You. There's something about the use of the character chi for the sound of tearing silk that overrides the allusions and liberates the scene from those references. The scene is not a warning against waste or squandering, although given what is about to happen to the Jia family, it could be. I think that it is the character chi that achieves that. It combines the negotiation with social hierarchy. Sorry, I should have showed you this, but you have it now. It combines the negotiation with social hierarchy in its conventional association with derisive laughter and the negotiation with affordance in the sound of tearing silk. No one else in Baoyu's apartment can comprehend his or Qingwen's interest in tearing fans. Sorry, we want to go here. Their singular understanding of this affordance of a silk fan creates a shared private moment. The typical association with fans on Duanwujie is with imperial gifting. The narrative reminds us of this when Yuanxun sends fans from the imperial palace for the girls. That this tearing of fans takes place on Duanwujie highlights that the fans' affordances for Qingwen and Baoyu are counterintuitive. When another one of the maids, Sheyue Musk, happens by, Baoyu grabs her fan. Qingwen and Baoyu then laugh heartily as Qingwen tears Sheyue's fan in half and then in half again. Sheyue exclaims, "Don't do that, right? It's wicked to waste things like that." Qingwen calls a halt to the game just when Sheyue suggests that she get up herself and get the fan box. Sorry, go back there. In other words, act as a servant. "I'm rather tired just now. I think I shall tear some more to get tomorrow." Her words recall the elegant formulation of Wang Xizhi's son Wang Huizhi in the Shishuo Xinyu. When asked why he turned back before arriving at a friend's home, "I came riding my interest. When my interest ceased, I turned back. 情兴而来，兴尽而返." Baoyu and Qingwen appear simply to enjoy the sound that the silk makes as they tear. Then the moment is over, and Qingwen ensures that the aestheticization of waste remains a private and privileged language between herself and Baoyu by calling her a halt to the game. In sum, Qingwen has a unique perception of the affordances of a fan. She sees fans in a way that no one else would, but she also has a unique perspective on the affordance of a servant. She uses servitude in a way that none of the other servants do, and perhaps that is why readers have been obsessed with her. She takes the idea of hierarchical intrasubjectivity one step further. It is partly the affordances of the character Chi that make this possible. Cao Xueqin understands the affordances of the character Chi in a way that no one else does. And this allows him to aestheticize rather than moralize waste. In sum, right, as we draw to a close, I would note that紅樓夢reveals that compression, to use Wallach's language, can be an advantage for a minor character. In紅樓夢's terms, compression is not something that naturally happens to minor character. The assertion that characters must contend for the limelight is something that紅樓夢mobilizes strategically.紅樓夢imagines compression to be something that the minor character can instrumentalize, the ability to flatten oneself, to anticipate what your master would want you to say in a certain situation, is the critical affordance of a servant. Forster's terminology of round and flat underlies the privileging of psychic depth and interiority that we have come to believe is essential to our major characters. In紅樓夢's complex system of major and minor character, characters can exceed minorness with their ability to inhabit other subject positions. That is by an intrasubjectivity that is nearly always implicitly hierarchical. The minor characters that are most enlivened, like Hongyu and Qingwen, govern the conditions of their own affordance. What minor characters provide, offer, or furnish is a matter of their own complex negotiation with social hierarchy. This is how a minor character is different from a mailbox, a shopping basket, or an iPhone. Cao Xueqin's use of the character Chi can be taken as emblematic of that complex negotiation of a servant with her own affordance. As we close, I'd like to remind us that, once again, that the story of the stone is not a realist novel. Its primary concern is the unity of form and emptiness. Anthony Yu, in his classic Rereading the Stone, observes that the story of the stone's affirmation of the Buddhist view of reality is always paired with a subtle but powerful theory of fiction that Cao Xueqin uses to confound his reader's sense of reality. In this regard, Yu quotes an anecdote from the Northern Song, Night Talks of the Cold Studio, 冷斋夜话, entitled Speaking to a Fool of Dreams, Speaking of Dream Within a Dream. Right? So let's look at this kind of closely. I fixed this and then somehow it's like a minor character that went from a disc to a sphere. The title is exceeding the space that it should have. But during the Longshuo reign period, the monk Qie was traveling in the Jianghuai region. His deeds were extraordinary. Someone asked him, "What is your surname?" He Xing. Right? He answered, "I am surnamed He." Right? And here the joke is, of course, that He and what, right? The He, the surname, and what are homonyms. He was then asked, "From what country do you originate?" He said, "I am from the country of He," or what country, right? Li Yong of the Tang was making a stone inscription and did not understand what the monk said. So he wrote in a biography, "The great master surnamed What was a man of the country of what," right? Where he might have written, "The great master surnamed He was a man of the country of He." Either way, this is truly what is known as speaking to a fool of a dream. Okay, and so then in second paragraph, actually, the anecdote goes on. The monk Zanning took his biography and compiled it in the history of monks and explicated it with the following, right? So here we have another turn of the screw. He said that he was surnamed He, and this is similar to Kang Hui, who was originally from the country of Kangju, Samarkand, and so received the name Kang Seng Hui, a historical personage, Kang Seng Hui. The location of the country of what, right, is to the northeast of Suiye and is a vassal state of the Suiye kingdom. Right? This is also like speaking of dreams within dreams. One can shut the book and laugh. So we see here the way in which the search for reference, right? The idea of a historical referent, of a biographical referent is mocked. Right? In the wake of the new redology of the Republican period, this anecdote could be seen as a meta-commentary on the many attempts to find historical reference for the story of the stone. But it is also, I think, a commentary on readings of the story of the stone that dwell on the psychological fullness of the characters. It is characters like Hongyu and Qingwen who remind us that, in Forster's terms, a character is a word mass, a collection of words on a page, a marvelous disc that can, on occasion, puff into a sphere. Thank you very much.
Can we maybe swap? Use it in
Sure.
the middle and I'll...
Sure. Good idea. So yeah, I'd love to hear any questions you might have.
Right. So I would like to suggest that if you have a question, then you raise your hand and introduce yourself and then ask the question. All right, let's open the floor. Okay, weigh in.
Thank you very much for the wonderful talk. And I just have one question about the translation as a shadow character. Sometimes in Chinese, like also mirror character, right? Yes. Shadow character sometimes, like in the Journal of the West, maybe 六耳猕头 is a shadow character of Sun Wukong, right? But in some like Jin Pingmei, but like Song Huilian and Wang Liu'er, more like a mirror of the Pan Jinglian. So yeah, that's my question. Yeah,
you're actually making me think of, so chapter 44, the Zhiyuanzhai commentary goes into a gloss, right, on shadow character that Chen Chengli talks about. But Zhiyuanzhai talks about shadow characters as being 镜中花, right, flowers in a mirror, 水中月, right? So explicitly bringing in this idea of the mirror, explicitly bringing sort of, Buddhist notions of the illusory nature of form. But it also, it's complex, right? In that, and then he starts to talk about like other things that are not necessarily related to that illusory notion of form, like, right? It's like rats and burrows. And then at the end, he says, this is like Guanyin playing with her 1,000 arms, right? So it's really interesting. I feel like Zhi Yanzhai has a much more mysterious and supple notion of shadow character than Zhang Xinzhi does, for example, right? And that's actually where I would like to take this paper next, right? Is to think about the different ways in which we're playing with that various conceptions of shadow character here. Thanks. Yeah.
Eva.
Thank you so much for fascinating talk. Eva from the translation program of the School of Chinese. Your talk has brought back a lot of sweet memory to me because I was a translation student here. In my day as a student of the translation program, we were asked to study the translation of紅樓夢by David Hawkes, and this is the book we were asked to buy. I also have a question to ask about the translation, like the translation of the names of the minor and major characters. And as you can see, David Hawkes adopt two distinct, at least two systems for translating the names of the major or minor and minor characters. So for the major characters, he used transliteration, pinyin.
Right.
And for the minor characters, he used a different system, like, semantic translation, close to semantic translation, like Xiyin as aroma, Pina as patience. So that kind of reflect the characters of these minor characters. And my question is, well, as a student, I was wondering why this is the way he translated it, why not the other way? Because by transliteration, you tend to make the name more exotic because it's by pinyin. It's hard for us to remember those names. But by using like aroma, sky bright, like patience, it makes it easier for us to remember all those characters.
Right.
So I want to hear your views about this translation approach. Does it kind of reinforce this hierarchical intrasubjectivity, or it help elevate this minor character status or what?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think that it actually posits a degree of hierarchy that is maybe more fixed than what I'm talking about here. So as you know, the major characters, Bao Yu, Dai Yu, right, Bao Chai, their names are not translated. And I think that gives the reader just sort of a sense of possibility, right? I think Hawkes was worried about having 350 plus named characters and was worried that if he put them all into pinyin, the translation wouldn't work that well because we wouldn't be able to remember who was who, right? So to call Jiaoxing lucky or Ping'er patience, I think is almost kind of a mnemonic device. But I do think it kind of reduces the characters to a single characteristic, right? And that is what Forster and Wallach actually think of as defining for a minor character, right? That Mrs. Micawber always says, I will never desert Mr. Micawber, right? That's her defining characteristic. And I've been trying to argue against that, right? And to see it as too limiting. And I think also with the translation of the names, you omit the punning. So Shiren, right? When you look at that name, you think of her ability to capture or entrap, if you think about it, right? So it is aroma, right? But there is also a sense of the entrapment of scent, right? And that's all contained in the character, but cannot, be contained in the translation. I'm thinking about, so there is a minor character who's kind of the definition of a minor character whose name Hawkes does not translate, 不是人. Right? So this is like a character from Jinping Mei, right? Like Ying Bo-jue, right? His name is a pun for not a person, right? Or some people think maybe also not humane, right? Not having a ren. And actually, so Jia Yun's uncle is 不是人. His he's the son of Wu Shaozi, right? Which is also a pun for there not being the Shaozi, right? So there is a way in which with these puns, right, Cao Shiqin is also playing on that ability of minor characters to sort of take form from emptiness, right? And also playing with that sort of 和性, 和国 kind of trope, right, that we looked at the very end. Thank you.
Maybe Miao Xiaojing first.
Oh, okay.
Oh, thank you for this fantastic talk. Because I'm a Tang person, so I just want to quickly mention one very interesting thing that in this anecdote about Li Yun that you just mentioned. I find this is a very interesting anecdote, especially Li Yun is picked because he has this notorious reputation for charging people insane amount of money for writing steel inscriptions. And I just find this is very interesting in this particular anecdote, which I think may be a later fabrication, but they specifically pick Li Yong as this person who they like to make fun of. But then I have another question about one particular aspect that you mentioned where the minor characters, they sort of elevate out of their minoreness by passing the message for those who main character or because I'm really interested in this idea of impersonation or passing message or writing on behalf of other person. So I'm curious, are there opposite situations where the main character or people with in the Jiafu or in other people the host or their the people they are served like Bao Yu or Dai Yu or other people who might pass on message for those minor characters. If so, are the situations quite similar or quite different? So this is, I'm just out of curiosity. Thank you.
Wait, say it again. Can you repeat what you said at the very end? I loved what you said about Li Yong, right? That he's being made fun of as a pedant, right? A furu, right?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
it goes very well with his charging too much for inscriptions. But remind me.
So what I'm curious is, are there any examples in the Honglou Meng where those main characters they would pass along messages for those minor characters? For example, like Bao Yu might be passing a message delivered by, let's say, Qin Wen to Dai Yu. But I'm just thinking, are there any situations where the situation were reversed, not the minor character passing along the message for those main characters,
right,
but the different situation?
Right. I am sure there are, because Bao Yu really wants to inhabit minorness, right? Right? Like he takes such pleasure out of serving Pingwen or Yinglian, right? So in some ways, I feel like that's what makes him feminine. It's not his eating rouge, right? I haven't paid attention to that though, and I will now because you said that. I've been paying attention to all the times when like Li Momo comes on stage. I mean, it seems as though she comes on stage, delivers a message and leaves, right? It does seem as though there's this infrastructure of message bearing, right? That is so crucial to the functioning of the Jia household. There's a scene in chapter 6 as well, where Xifeng calls out Jiarong, come back. And then this like unnamed mass of of servants outside the window, right, calls Jiarong, come back. So I do see it as sort of like definitive of minorness in some way, but also I think that a protagonist like Bao Yu is going to want to inhabit that position. So I will look for it. Thank you.
Loretta?
Hello, my name is Loretta Kim. I'm in the School of Modern Languages and Cultures here, but I'm a historian of the Qing. So thank you very much for your talk. And most of these concepts are very new to me, so please excuse me for my awkward question. So originally when I saw the title of your talk, I was thinking minor as in terms of frequency or infrequency of appearance in the novel. So, I realized that now you're talking about hierarchy and so on. So I was trying to relate it to something I understand a little better. So I was thinking about major and minor officials in the Qing bureaucracy, right? And the minor ones are the ones where we have trouble finding the birth and death dates, or, they appear as people within the documents, but they're not the people who write the documents of the emperor and so on. So that's where I'm coming from. So my question is a bit two-part. The first question is, first of all, a musical analogy came to mind for me. So I think especially with your example of Dianar, I was thinking about when the harmony overshadows the melody in music, right? And how that can be deliberate, but also that can, for like beginning musicians, if the right hand is overshadowed by the left hand, it's something that needs to be corrected. So I wondered if that's something that you had in mind when you were thinking about minorness and kind of fleshing out what you described, or I guess I felt like you were arguing against this idea of flatness and kind of the rounding out of characters. I still don't understand how round and flat characters work, but that was part of it. But the other part was you mentioned compression, which I'd love to learn more about. But I was also thinking more about actually, it just evaded me. Another C word, sorry. About kind of compensation. Because I thought, when you were bringing up the different examples, whether it was Hongyu or whatever, that these people were compensating for their lack of status, or maybe even the lack of background or biography in a sense with their personality. So I wondered if that was also underpinning some of your analysis. So thank you.
Wow, it's so interesting. Well, to start where you started, frequency of mention is really interesting because now we have, AI, right? So all these people are posting, lists of character frequency and how often they're mentioned. And so now we know that Shiren is mentioned more times than Dayu. How could that be, right? So so I don't think minorness is that related to frequency of mention. In terms of music, as you're speaking, I'm thinking, gosh, sometimes the lyrics work against the chords. And I'm wondering if that's partly what's happening as the discs become spheres. But I'll think about your metaphor of the left hand sort of not understanding its own affordances, right? And thumping too loud. And then, sorry, what was the third
It was
thing?
about kind of compensation.
Yes, compensation. I think the shadow characters work towards that. And, when we first met Hongyu in the slide, right, she had that magnificent head of black hair and that long, thin face, right? And so you think immediately, right, of other characters with long, thin faces like Qingwen. But yeah, it does seem as though, there is, compensation is an excellent term, right? I think compression is the opposite. Compression is the idea that there is a fullness of human character, right, that becomes flattened because of the needs of the text. And the thing that really upsets me about Wallach is this idea of a finite degree of textual attention, because he gets quoted for that over and over again. And I feel like紅樓夢is really playing with that idea of finite textual attention. And there's so many times when there's no need for us to think of, say, Baochai and Dayu as being in competition, except that紅樓夢is making us think that way by playing with that idea of a finite degree of textual attention.
Professor Wall. I'm Yu Hui Shen. I teach at CUHK. I study Meeting. So thank you very much for such a refreshing talk. It's so exciting to see a great scholar like you doing Hong Long Feng, because I think
Is the microphone on?
Sorry.
Is the microphone on?
Oh, yeah. Okay, I should.
We can hear.
Right now it's on. Yeah.
No need to repeat.
Thank you. I mean, Hong Long Feng seems to be such an intimidating novel for all of us in the field, but then you're doing it. It's in such a refreshing way. To me, it's really exciting. I have two questions. One is basically what you're talking about. The minor characters today are within the Jia mansion, even within the garden. So while Xiaohong travels between inside and outside the garden, I'm wondering how about the supporting characters or minor characters who are outside the mansion? What kind of infrastructure that they actually imply? I guess it will be more social or in a male world, but I'm wondering how, because in a way we also say that Hong Lou Meng, the world inside and outside the garden or the dimension is sort of connected by supporting characters, minor characters, and the infrastructure, it seems that they imply expands from what is within a chamber. So I wonder, I really like to hear more about your insights on that. Second question is related to my own research about Xiqu. So the way that Xiaohong Hongyu comes up to stage, the stage reminds me of how, like in Chuanqi, the supporting characters sometimes would come unannounced instead of like the male characters. Sorry, the major protagonists. And yet, in Chuanqi, we have like scenes, individual scenes devoting to supporting characters that make them the highlights of each scene rather than the major, the protagonists. And then this appearance of Zhe Zixi really brings supporting characters to the center of the stage. It's similar to how for instance, when in one of the passages you quote, like to Xiaoxian, to read the Hong Lou Meng as the Xiaoxian, and then to select parts to read it, and in a way that might be interested or analogous to the reading or watching dramatic excerpts that highlight specific supporting characters rather than focusing on the protagonists. And so my question would be, in the sense, I think readers are invited to create or participate in creating or in understanding the infrastructure of the supporting characters, or even in bringing them to stage, in bringing them to the center of attention, of the textual attention. So I wonder, in that sense, you've talked quite incisively about how the text direct or manipulate readers' attention. I wonder how readers would respond in that sense. I know it's hard to talk about readership, but in the sense, how can we anticipate that in a way that readers would become an active contributors or creators of even those supporting characters and even the infrastructure they try to imply? Thank you.
Yeah, that is one of the questions that is driving me. And it's probably an unanswerable question, right? But many of the questions that drive us are not answerable. But I wanted to ask, like, how does Hong Lou Meng have this sort of anticipatory referentiality that lets all these sequels loose into the world, right? And as you say, once you have the dramatic sequels, there's so many directions we could go with that. We could talk about, the idea that Cao Shiqin considered writing Hong Lou Meng as a drama, but did not, and why, right? And I have been thinking about that and thinking about minor character, because the role of minor character on the stage is so different. I do think a lot of these sudden intrusions, I think I slipped up once, right, and said something like enters the stage, right? They do feel very stage-like. But on stage, I think it's harder to get the, Heguo type of feel, right? That there's some kind of sort of fetishistic enlivening going on, but we also need to remember that 色即是空, right? So I think part of the reason maybe, another unanswerable question, but, if we were to say, why did Cao Shiqin write this as a novel, not a drama? Maybe part of the reason is that it's there's a way in which he can answer that or talk about that idea of the identity of Kong and Se in a narrative, right, that he can't on the stage, right? Because every time we put the novel down, as long as it's a read text, it could have been a read drama as well, but as long as it's a read text, as soon as you put the novel down, right, you immediately have that sense that the illusion has disappeared. So then to go back to your first question about minor characters outside the garden, right? I think some of the minor characters outside the garden do fulfill these kinds of functions, right? Menzi, who I mentioned, the usher in chapter 4, perfect example of anticipating what Jiayun needs, thinks he's elevating his status by anticipating what Jiayun needs, but because Jiayun is such a cad, right? He has him dismissed, right? Again, slaps him back down, gets him out of the picture, right? Because he can't afford to have him elevated. Another thing that you remind me of too is that the arc of the novel is to make more and more clear the infrastructure of minor character, and to lead us to believe that the minor characters, whom we only saw in part in the beginning, do have these full existences in the interstices of the novel, right? So somewhere in the 50s, right, where, well, let's just say, chapters 37 to 42, right? That's the highlight of, the aesthetic of waste in the garden, right? The protagonist's enjoyment of the garden. We have Xifeng telling Liu Lala how to make a recipe for eggplant that tastes like chicken, right? You take 12 chickens and steam the dried eggplant so that it absorbs the flavor of the chicken. I've always loved that scene because I feel like there's kind of a transubstantiation of the chicken into the eggplant from major to minor. But supposedly also it doesn't work. My students tell me they tried it and it doesn't work. But by the 50s, we're actually, when Xifeng gives that recipe, there's no indication of who does that, right? It's like, oh, well, this is how you do it, right? By the, chapter 55 or so, we are in the kitchen, right? With the cook, right? And seeing all the tensions about scarcity of resources and negotiation to get her daughter a better place in the garden, right? So it's almost as though the arc of the novel itself, follows that idea that discs can become spheres.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Sifu.
Hi, I'm Shifu Tan from the School of Chinese under the program of Chinese History and Culture. Thanks a lot for the wonderful talk. I'm not literature scholars, but I have the impression that the issues of Qing and Yu, like emotions and desires, are important aspects of the novel. So I'm just wondering whether you notice any differential ways that the author described about Qing and Yu in relation to major and minor characters, and whether you think that there are some distinctive roles that minor character play in portrayal, understanding these aspects.
Wow, let me think about that for a minute. So I'm thinking about the visit to Taishu Hanjing in chapter 5, right? Where Bao Yu is supposed to learn about Qing, right? I feel like Cao Shuqin makes a lot of mileage out of the slippage between Qing and Yu, right? Like when he says Qing, it could be just emotion, right? It could be unqing, right? But it could also be Yu, right? So chapter 5, when Bao Yu goes and Jinghuan Xiangu, when he goes to the land of illusion, and Jinghuan Xiangu is supposed to be teaching him about Qing, he takes those registers, right? And he starts with the most supplementary register of the minor characters, right? The Bu Ce. So that would imply, right, that these minor characters do have some kind of role, right? And then at the end of chapter 5, beginning of chapter 6, right, it's with Shiren, right, that he first experiences Yu, right? And Anthony Yu talks about that scene and calls our attention to the fact that actually the wet dream is supposedly in Buddhist thought like a indication that dream and waking are sort of equal planes of, ontologically, those planes are equal. But I'm trying to think, I haven't thought about this question much. I would phrase it in terms of, I think, the capacity of minor characters and things like fans to take Bao Yu from Qing to Bu Qing, right? That's his trajectory through the novel. The Zhi Yanzhai commentary through chapter 31, so this is another way of looking at it, right? Zhi Yanzhai commentary that prefaces chapter 31 says that this Qingwen Sishan scene is about Bao Yu, Qing Bu Qing. And it seems to imply that Qingwen is actually Bu Qing, right? And that the scene is about Bao Yu having Qing for Bu Qing. But I think it's also sort of heralding or prefacing the larger arc that he goes through, right, from Qing to achieving a state of Bu Qing as a monk. I mean, thank you for the question. I will continue to think about it. Yeah.
Jay.
Hi, Sophie. Thank you for the very interesting presentation and wonderful ideas about minor characters and things. I was very quite interested in the idea about affordability of things in a negotiation between different subjects, and in the case of Qingwen. Qingwen tearing the fans, you clearly demonstrated that fans themselves are a sign for the minor characters to negotiate their relationship with them, with the major characters' attention and thus also readers' attention. And in this case, whether Qingwen tears the fans with joy, with pleasure, or with anger, it doesn't matter much, because in Bao Yu's words, this is there's a difference whether she tears the fans with pleasure or with joy. One is she loves things. The other is she doesn't know how to love things, because she tears it with anger, right? But in both cases, this is just about Qingwen's subjectivity, not about the things' subjectivity. So I'm wondering if we can talk. You can talk more about materiality, and such as in the story of the stone, whether there are other examples in which things they offer more agencies.
In which things have more agency.
More agency.
Well, the stone. Yeah, it's such a good question. I'm not really comfortable thinking about agency, but I'm not sure why. You know, so we have the stone and the mirror, right? The stone explicitly has agency, right? Because it is Bao Yu, right? Both the stone and the mirror are figures for the book. The mirror, both the stone and the mirror have this sort of shape-shifting quality that, you know, that I described in my last book, which Mark mentioned. But I don't actually, I think the reason I'm not comfortable with agency is because the arc of紅樓夢is towards the evacuation of a subject position entirely for Bao Yu, right? So the thing that's so interesting about the mirror is that it allows a subject to exceed their subject position, right? And to see from many different angles, right? So yeah, so I will look for things that have agency, but not seeing it right now. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Camila. I'm from MA program. I would like to ask one questions that talk about the Hongyu. What I mentioned, there are 5 gels in the Dream of Red Chambers. That Baoyu, Jia Baoyu, Yan Baoyu, Miao Yu, Da Yu, and Hongyu. So, what do you think about? Are they echo with each other? And I think of the 5 elements. Because connected with the names, and also the name of the stones of story. The stone story is the Dream of Red Chamber, is red color, and Hongyu is also the red color. So do you think that actually she also echo with the whole story? So I just 2 questions. Thank you very much.
Your question actually works really well with your question, Xiaohu, right? I should have been thinking about Hong Yu, right? And her name. I think that in some ways, the Hong Yu, the name, the characters themselves call attention to the way in which it seems to elevate her undeservedly, right? Like her family must have had some designs, right? To have given her a name that refers both to Bao Yu and Da Yu, and also Hong, as you say, can refer both to Bao Yu and Da Yu as well, right? So it would seem, right, as though we have Da Yu, Bao Yu, Bao Chai, right? We have that sort of like Venn diagram type thing, right? I mean, it would seem that Hong Yu's name sort of almost even puts her at the top of that Venn diagram, but she's not, right? And I'm thinking a scene with Hong Yu that I didn't talk about actually at the end of chapter 24, right after the part that we looked at where she serves Bao Yu tea, gives him the message from Jia Yun. The end of chapter 24, she has this dream about Jia Yun that is related in a very experimental way, right? So Jia Yun is actually like making advances upon her, right? And we imagine this to be, narrated in real time. And then at the beginning of chapter 25, we find that it was all a dream, right? Which is really, really experimental, I think. But it does, it gives her this kind of fullness, right? This kind of sort of, again, disk becoming a sphere, right? So yeah, I feel like Hong Yu maybe is the place, right? The central character with that negotiation between flatness, the flatness of being slapped down, right? And then the desire to become full, right? And then the illusion of psychological fullness that we get because of her implied desire, right? And that too is related to Dai Yu, right? And at the end of chapter 24, when she has that dream, feels like a sort of reverberation of the end of chapter 23 when Dai Yu slumps against the rock. So maybe it is through this implication of Yu, right? Of desire, right? That she achieves the illusion of fullness there.
Chen Feng Tong, also from the Chinese History and Culture program, School of Chinese. So thank you for the inspired talk. But you must forgive me because my question is also has something to do with agency. So it's about, because what I think, if I understood correctly, one of the many fascinating points that you've shown us is that the agency of the minor characters is sort of displayed through violating the character act or the affordance that's given to them. So could you elaborate a bit more about the agency of the minor characters or minorness in general?
Yeah, it seems as though perhaps the agency of minor characters is to play with their own affordances, right? So we begin to see that in the scene with Hong Yu, but I think we really see that in the scene with Qing Wen, right? Where she says like, 你要打就打, right? So she's seemingly giving all the agency to Bao Yu, but somehow she's also taking it back. There's a real sort of jujitsu taking place there.
You see, people at Hong Kong U like agency. If there are no other questions, oh yeah, I think here, side.
Thank you for your wonderful lecture. I'm interested in your discussion on 请问
Can you
私善
quickly introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm a student. I'm an MPhil student from School of Chinese at HKU. I'm interested in your discussion on 请问私善. You mentioned that the character 私 may be correlated with the character 私 miss. And it reminds me of the thing that maybe 善 represents 善, which further reminds me of the Buddhist idea of gathering and parting of causes and conditions. So I'm interested in the question that is combining with the notion of 一笑千金. Is the writer in some ways attaching a physical value to the metaphysical idea or to the symbolic behavior of 私善? Is the deconstruction of substance in some ways itself a substance? Thank you.
What a cool question. I'm stuck on what you're saying about the homophones, right? The commentators will say things like 善, fan, 善也, right? Like goodness, right? And or what you say about 善, there is a lot of dispersal, that term, that character in this scene, right? Chapter 31 actually begins with a discussion of how Dai Yu likes 善, right? She likes dispersal. She thinks it's more accurate. But I think where I would take this is that it seems to me that the commentators very often, use these homophones to engage in a kind of like almost sonic slide, right? To create meaning, right? So 善也, right? But in a way, it's a kind of almost like phantasmic quality of reference, right? Like we have in the 和国 slide, right? That from, there's the idea that from the pun, you can derive the referent, right? But there's also a way in which, and this is, I think, the conclusion to my book, right? That 红楼梦 always keeps us sort of oscillating between two terms. That's why these puns are so important, right? 不是人, 贾雨村, right? 郑世银, all these names have puns in them. And I think it's important because there's always a little bit of an evacuation of substance in the pun, right? So that we're back in the land of 和国 through that sort of oscillation.
I hope you don't, oh yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for your talk. I had a question.
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh yeah. Sophie knows me. I'm Angie Becker. I teach in the Department of Chinese History and Culture at PolyU. And my question is about the sheer number of minor characters. You had said that there was something, was it 300 or 600 of them?
About over 350 named, about 1,000 in total.
Okay, so that's really striking to me. And I think in your talk, you were thinking a lot about minor characters and their narrative role, and this tension between object and character, roundness and flatness. And I wanted to ask about this point. You said a couple times, you said that Hong Lou is not a realist novel. And I was thinking, just the sheer number of minor characters like seems fantastical to me. And they seem to be largely women. They seem to be largely servants. So what is that fantasy about having thousands or hundreds of kind of servants surrounding you, supporting you, moving the plot of your life forward? Were any of these minor characters other types of figures? Like were there criminals or bandits or some other merchants amongst these minor characters? And when we think about just kind of like a sheer like mass of characters, of presence in a narrative, I often think about crowds and masses or class. And so I'm wondering too, if there's any kind of relationship between the way that the story is imagining the society at that time and how it's representing the world outside of the pages.
Mhm, mhm. There's a hand there
Follow up
too.
with this question.
Okay.
I'm Jenny from History Department. I'm hesitating to ask the question because you said this is not reflecting the real society, but as a historian, actually紅樓夢is also a source of inspiration, especially for those doing social history. So my question is kind of following this one. So many minor characters in紅樓夢. So what can this group of people tell us about hierarchy? You mentioned hierarchy, the terms throughout your presentation. So I think for historians, I just kept asking, and can I help me asking the question, what can this group of minor characters can help us understand more about the society and the hierarchy you mentioned in紅樓夢?
Yeah, probably they can tell us more about how people negotiate with hierarchy, right? I mean, I think that's how sort of the imputation of history, right, or even of our real life experience, right, helps us to be better readers, right? But I have to say, I felt very liberated when one of my graduate students said to me, I think you're still responding to the new redology, right? Because I have been really preoccupied to say that, you know, this landscape of hundreds of minor characters creates the illusion of reference, right? That it's紅樓夢's job to create the illusion of reference, right? And I think part of the reason I've been so obsessed with the idea, you know, form is emptiness doesn't mean that form exists in a void or leads to the void. It means that form has no reference, right? And that's probably the introduction to my book. But in some ways, I am responding to the fact that we're still in the wake of 胡适, right? We're still reading this as autobiographical. All the work on court life, the courtly visual culture, material culture, which I've participated in, right? All of that depends on this idea that there is autobiographical reference, that we're talking about Cao Shuqin's family in some way, right? And at some point, I feel like it's been 100 years. We can't do that anymore. But to get to Angie's question, yes, there are lots and lots of minor characters who are not servants, right? But, you know, Hesan, right? Burglars. I'm thinking in part, you know, one way of training ourselves not to see this as a realist novel is to think about Shang Wei's ideas about the sort of heterotopic quality of Jinping Mei, right? And so, you know, Shang Wei at Columbia responded to many decades of scholarship on the Jinping Mei's use of imbrication of many different kinds of texts, right? It's almost a collage of many different kinds of texts to say that the novel itself is kind of a heterotopia, right? And that it can't be read from start to finish as though it had a single theme, right? And that when we look at all the selections from joke books or short stories or sex manuals that have infiltrated the text of Jinping Mei, we really can't read it as a single authored text that, you know, again, that can be explained in some kind of structuralist fashion, right? I would say we kind of really have to look at almost the seams, right? Of the collage, right? The way in which different elements are juxtaposed. But I feel like Shang Wei's insight has sort of a larger relevance in that more and more we are finding that texts that we thought were as single authored, right? And have read as even autobiographical, like 浮生六记, right, are actually compilations of many different texts, right? Hong Lou Meng, I've been looking for moments like that. In chapter 74, there is a dialogue between Dai Yu and Shi Xiangyun about Aotu that actually is taken straight from Yang Shen Anji. I think there are probably many more places like that, right? So that brings us to a totally different kind of reading, right? Where we could see certain minor characters as being there like jokes, right? Like 不是人, right? It's almost like if you think of the multiple, Shang Wei talks about how he feels like the novel's text itself is an incarnation of the multi-layered text of a Lei Shu, right? And that the joke level sometimes infiltrates the drama or the narrative, right? We could see 不是人 as a moment like that, right? Yeah, so we don't have to think about this in terms of reference at all.
If I'm permitted to ask one last question. This is Christian.
Can you turn on the microphone?
Yeah, sure. This is Christian Pack from the University of Alberta, also the alumni of here. I do have a questions, like try following up with both of them, both of the questions. So I do have a questions regarding the about your experience of researching on this topic, especially talking about the minor characters. So I know that Hong Lou Meng like normally consists of servants and different, like in the majority of the minor characters are servants, but my personal research interest is lies in early Tang intellectual histories and also the literary culture as well. So like a little bit allowed me to fall into my research area, like is there any other hierarchy minor characters that you have been spotting on, and what is the obstacles when looking into that kind of characters and to form your argument? And then this is the main questions I would like to ask. And the second question is, I just want to echo to your reality questions. Actually, I do agree with you. It's a little bit like when I was doing researches on, especially Tang history, when we talk about the Tang anecdotes, we cannot always use the anecdote to refer to the true history, because anecdotes is also consists of some like minor anecdotes, minor stories copied inside it. So we cannot definitely take into account all the time. So that's why I also would like to echo to you. I do agree with you. Like it could be a references, but if we really look into a historical aspect, it might not be a really proper historical sources where you're referring to. So this is the second point I would like to echo to you.
Thank you. Thank you. So your question is, are there hierarchies for minor characters other than servitude? Is that right?
Yes. Or is there any other examples you can come up with, like besides servants? Because it seems that the arguments currently is formed based on the servant, like Qin Wen or the Hou Yu, like they're all servants. But is there any other non-servants like minor character you have been spotting on?
I haven't taken it there. And I probably could. I'm thinking of Miao Yu when you say that, right? But Miao Yu kind of exists outside hierarchy. Right? Then, I mean, when we think about all the characters on the registers, most of them are either servants or have some kind of place in the Jia family, right? And then there is that whole another level of minor characters that we were just talking about, right? The ones who can erupt as jokes or part maybe from an imported short story. I feel like Hong Lou Meng really does have it's very multi-textured in a way that we don't acknowledge. We think of the first 80 chapters as being written in one hand, and then we think of the next 40 as being written in another fashion. But actually, I think, if you look at the last 40 and the way they suture themselves onto the first 80, I think that Gao is actually trying to imitate the later style of Cao Sheqin, right? And we don't want to acknowledge that. So we say that the chapters on the You sisters, for example, are Feng Yue Bao Jian, right, that they were in an earlier version of the novel, right? But that's just a tradition, right? It's just a myth. So, we see that the novel plays with many different kinds of modalities, many different kinds of textures. Anyway, I'll keep thinking about your question.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Okay.
In your summary, you mentioned the Heart Sutra, and at the very end of the talk, you tease us with Buddhism, and I noticed in your answers actually you refer much more to form is emptiness, emptiness form, etc. So I'm assuming you have it much more on your mind than you actually talked about, and I would like to ask you to elaborate a little bit about how you see the role of these ideas that were formulated in the Heart Sutra, or generally maybe in Buddhism, and if that is just play, or do you see it more philosophically, or, and you know where I'm coming from, being in Chinese religious studies, is it possible to see that in a not exclusively secular way?
So I would respond by saying, I think we're dealing with literati Buddhism. Do you know what I mean? Right? And many years ago, I said to my colleague, Bob Sharf, I feel really guilty that I don't know more about just, what kind of Buddhism Cao Xueqing could have been thinking about, working with, practicing. And he's like, Sophie, the Buddhism in紅樓夢is so general. So in that sense, yeah, you have the very conventional division into philosophical and religious within the text itself. I have been thinking a lot about the way in which Chapter 1 tropes on the Heart Sutra and what its relevance could be for the kinds of things that we've been talking about today. And I think it's more mysterious than than we acknowledge, right? Because Qing supposedly has a role, right? But we don't really know what Qing is there. I mean, I feel like just as though whenever a critic or scholar tries to define Yi-in, my eyes glaze over. This is the term that Jinghuan Xiangu uses in Chapter 5 to define Bao Yu, right? And it's usually translated as lust of the mind, right? But what does lust of the mind mean? Anyway, so just as we don't really know what Yi-in means, I think Li Wei does the best job of anybody in glossing it. I feel like we don't really know what's going on in Chapter 1 when Kong Kong Daoren supposedly, from form moves to emptiness, moves to Qing, and then back to emptiness and form again. One thing that is really interesting about the Heart Sutra that I didn't know, maybe you know, is that there's a scholarly tradition, Yan Natier or John Natier, that it was a chant, right? It's very short, right? Which led her to look at this. Her thesis is that actually it was never really a sutra. It's the essence of the teachings. That's why it's called the Xinjing. And it was a chant that probably was reverse translated back into Sanskrit, and from Sanskrit then into Japanese and Korean. So it appears to be a sutra, but it's not a sutra. And I think that's really interesting too, because if you think about the referential quality of a chant, right? If you were to ask a teacher, a Buddhist teacher, what does Om mean? They wouldn't want to tell you, right? They wouldn't want to say anything or to put it into words, right? And so I feel like in part that invocation of the Heart Sutra in Chapter 1 is like that, right? That we can't pin down what it means in words.
Officially, we have until 12:30, but I think you must be very tired, having arrived yesterday 5 a.m. and having already had a lot of questions. So I would say, unless there's a really urgent question that somebody still has, I would suggest that maybe we conclude, and we thank you very much for your lovely talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks all of you. Those were wonderful questions. So appreciated.